how the heck are you supposed to build a complete world from scratch? Even after building one world already, I still haven't found the answer. But while deep in the process of world building last time, I stumbled onto an intriguing method. I wanted to try it out, but since it required starting from scratch and I was already halfway through my world building, I decided to shelve it. Until today, when I will finally be revisiting this world building method. The method, created by the Hugo Award winning author Jemisin, can be summarized like this. First, create the physical world, then design a culture to fit it, and lastly, create a story from within this world. To me, this order seems very logical and organic, and this method is supposed to be fast too. In fact, Jemisin claims you should be able to design the foundations for a new world in an hour or less. However, as a world building novice, this sounds a little bit unreasonable to me, so I'll be aiming to complete Jemisin's entire process, including designing a world from scratch and creating multiple story premises set in this world by the end of the day. Okay, so let's get started on some world building with this Jemisin process, because I anticipate it's going to take me a little bit longer than her 60 minutes. Let's be real. So let's just get started looking through some of the basic stuff. I want to show you some of what she talks about because I do think it's good information. One of the most interesting concepts she talks about in this PowerPoint is the concept of immersion. Basically, she's talking about how as the immediateness and the reader's connection to a single character increases, the more immersed they'll be in that person's head. And if they're more immersed, then they can handle a bigger learning curve. But if you're telling a story from perspective that's more distant with a bunch of POVs, that the reader is less immersed in any one character's head, then it's going to be harder for the reader to handle all of that learning curve. After reviewing the concepts at the start of the PowerPoint, I was ready to jump in and start creating my new world. So the first thing that she talks about is deciding what your planet is going to be like, the different aspects of the planet, and how the people will have adapted to them. So we need to decide on these sorts of things. Is it going to be habitable? What are the continents going to look like? The world overall? What's the climate going to be like? Flora, fauna, all that stuff. So I'm basically trying to do some research right now on where the people are kind of living in this world. I think what I want to do is somewhere kind of difficult, a harsh sort of region, like maybe on the edge of a desert, but they're next to some sort of river or something so they can actually, survive. So I'm trying to figure out what the terrain looks like next to those places, but I've been struggling to find using like Google Street View in like Iraq and Syria.
Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
So I tried Egypt with the Nile River and I'm getting a little bit more. Anyway, we'll keep trying to research and whatnot and try to figure out more about these sorts of regions. I do think it's going to be Earth-like just because I'm trying to do this in a day and I don't have time to understand a bunch of physics. So we're going with Earth. I know it's a little bit easier, but easier for people to understand as well. Let's just keep doing some research, trying to find out more about these regions of the world. Okay, so now I'm going to be looking into the details of the actual geography of the world, the continents, and whatnot. I found a few cool tools online that I've been using to do this recently. This page has like a million different fantasy map making tools. So the one that I want to do uses this one because with this one, it generates something, but then afterward you can decide how you want to change it. See, there's like different seeds or whatever, and if you change them, then it changes the initial map, but then you can decide how you want to change it by like filling in different things. So that is what I'm going to be using here to just create my little continent. I just figured out the general geography of the continent. So this is what I'm thinking it's going to look like overall. And I do want to note that the continent is not necessarily placed in the center of the actual planet. I think that the equator is going to be somewhere toward the south of this screen. And who knows if there's other continents, but the one that I'm going to focus on here is this one. And thus we have concluded the first step. We know it's habitable in most of the places. We know what at least the main continent is going to look like. We know what the climate is overall. It's a northern hemisphere continent, and the south is next to the equator, the northern area potentially tundra, and then the flora and fauna are going to be adapted to this climate, and I think we're going to have them be mostly similar to Earth-like flora and fauna. So I thought that I was done with the physical characteristic stuff, but then I realized that I don't know anything about weather. So I was just doing a bunch of research into how weather works and how climates work because of the different characteristics of the world, the movement of air and water. So I'm gonna download a picture of this and then I'll try to figure out what the different climates are based on what I now know about weather and climate. It's time for some mood music. So I figured out the different sorts of distinct separations of weather patterns. So we have the equator here, and we have the Tropic of Cancer, I think it's called. I don't know what this one is called in the tundra. But long story short, these different segments of the globe will determine areas of pressure and thus determine how the winds blow throughout those different areas. And that's part of what creates this sort of desert region here, because the winds would come up against these mountains. As the air rises, all the water would be sucked out of it. By the time it gets over the mountains, it's dry, causing this area to be very dry. Let's continue with the next step, which is... I don't know, let's see what she did. So first she figured out the continents, fault lines and mountains, then she figured out the winds, and then she figured out how weather patterns would work based on these winds, I guess. So that's what we're gonna figure out, weather patterns and climate here. So I created a simplified version of a climate classification using my admittedly basic understanding of weather patterns and climates across the world, and kind of mapping over things from the factors that I know influence climates in different areas. All these various factors I tried to include in deciding the different climate classification zones for the continent. Anyway, so now we have this beautiful colored something. So I'm going to move on to the next step, and we can decide on the cultures of the various people living in these different regions, influenced by where they live, what's available to them, and all sorts of these things. So we're moving on to the next section, building a society. And yes, I have low battery again. Okay, so now that my computer's not at risk of just randomly dying, I am ready to continue. I'm actually realizing that there's more cultures than I initially anticipated that may be present here. So let's talk about those first, and then I'm going to tell you what I'm actually planning on doing for the remainder of this world building exercise. So because of these different regions, this is a pretty temperate region, and also it's guarded by these mountains. So we know that there's going to be some sort of civilization there. We also can anticipate that up in the north where it's colder but where there's still some sorts of fertile areas, we can anticipate there might be another culture living there. In addition, on this island up north, we can anticipate that there might be another culture living in the fertile regions. Also, because of the equator, we have a more jungle sort of region, more of a rainforest region, so there's going to be people living here as well, but they'll obviously be different from the peoples living in other areas. However, those are not the people that I'm most interested in. The peoples here in between the two mountains surviving along these rivers. This is the society and culture that I want to focus on for the rest of this video. So let's continue along with the steps that N.K. Jemisin gives us here. So what she advises to start off with is figuring out what they would need to do to survive based on where they live. So in her example, agriculture is difficult, there's tsunamis, earthquakes, storms frequent, so that means they have to depend on trade and the sea and whatnot. I need to do the same thing for my world and figure out, based on where these people live, how are they going to survive? So I just figured out some of the basic details of their life in this area and maybe how the culture might change based on this. Because they live in such a dry area, they have a very tough, resilient sort of culture where famine is common. They have annual flooding of the river that passes through their country, and it's seen as this like religious occurrence, some sort of gift from God. And also, I'm thinking they might have some sort of religious component where it contains this fasting aspect to make meaning of these really hard times where people are just barely getting by. They probably have some strict rules about prioritization of resources during famine. I was also thinking that because of the flooding, agriculture is possible, but there's like very limited time, so it's a really rushed sort of affair, and people have to be really on their toes to make sure they're able to take advantage of that time. And I was also thinking that they might potentially trade with the neighbors to the east, people who live over here who have more fertile lands. So that's what I've got so far as like characteristics based on the geography. But now we're going to go into a little bit more detail. So in this next step, Jemisin is talking all about sociology basically, and how these simple things can have profound effects. I've read The Tipping Point twice recently because I wanted to make sure I absorbed the information, and I already read Guns, Germans, and Steel. I need to reread that book, but I understand the major details, and actually during this video I did take some time to listen to a summary of some of the major points from that book, and I may have to finish listening to the rest of that. But for now, let's proceed on to the next step. If I get lost at any point, then I can come back and read some summaries and stuff to get myself on track. She's advising you to pick 3 sociological characteristics to start with, in conjunction with the physical ones that we already talked about. So let's just get started with that. Let's figure out these 3 different characteristics and start trying to figure out how they might influence the society. So I just figured out 2 of the 3 sociological characteristics on which I'm going to base the society. However, I still haven't figured out which one I want to choose as the 3rd one. I really don't know which one it's going to be. So that's where I'm having a little bit of difficulty right now, but we'll get back to that in a second. First, let's go through these first 2 sociological characteristics. The first is religion/government, and you'll notice that those 2 are kind of merged because of the other characteristics like I described before, where they live and how there's this annual, somewhat regular flooding, that they have this religion around various gods, and because one of the responsibilities of these gods is governing these yearly floods and making sure that this region can actually grow their own food, they're worshipped very fervently by the people, and the religious leaders are seen to be communicating between the gods responsible for this and the people. So since they're like this bridge, they are the ones who hold the most sway in society. So basically that leads to some sort of theocratic government where there is a absolute monarchy with the religious and governmental head being the one running everything, and underneath them there's sort of a hierarchy of bureaucrats who help run the smaller aspects of the government. The second major thing that I'm including here is one of those typical secondary world things. There's some element that's not present in our world that changes the culture of this world, and that is something I'm calling, for now, bloodstone. And basically this stone is very rare. It's only found in these mountains along the eastern side of this civilization. It's not found on the eastern side of the mountains, only the western side. And because the mountains are so tall and difficult to pass, they're really only available to the people who live in this desert region. And the reason the bloodstone are so sought after is because they're useful for 2 major purposes and then a 3rd kind of secondary one. They are melted down, and after undergoing the process of this melting, when they cool, they become ridiculously hard and they can hold an edge for a very long time. You can see where this is going. They make for these valuable weapons of this country or for other people who want to trade with this country and get those resources. And also these stones have a very deep red color and some sort of glowing of light, which is not understood by any of the people currently living there, but they have a faint glow to them. So they're often used in jewelry because of this beautiful aspect of them as well. Long story short is, this is what the country is looking like. This is what the culture is looking like so far, and hopefully this will be interesting to you. I want to provide all of these details because I want to be really open with this story, and if I actually decide to write a book within this story, I would like to continue to be that open and just tell you everything that's going on basically. I don't want to hold anything back or worry about spoilers or any of that stuff. I just want to be very open with you on what's going on. Speaking of being open, I don't have the 3rd aspect yet of the culture of like the foundations of the society, but I'm thinking that that's actually a good thing because it's about time for me to take a break, and hopefully during that break I will think of some sort of idea, or maybe give my brain a little bit of a rest. When I come back, I'll think of something. Okay, so I'm back and ready to continue with this world building experiment. The main thing I want to focus on here is coming up with the 3rd of the sociological focuses. So I didn't really come up with any ideas during my break, but hopefully the rest will have given me a little bit more brain power to be able to do it. So let's try and figure out what we're gonna make a focus in this civilization. So I decided to focus on social structure as the third cultural aspect, and mostly I was originally thinking of focusing on families, but it also ended up working its way a little bit into kind of how society is structured because of the fragile environment in which they live and the fact that food is not always readily available. One of the main aspects is the fact that society is broken down by families rather than like individuals. So each family is kind of like its own unit, and each family is judged by the ruler as a group rather than as individuals. And these judgments by the ruler matter specifically during times of famine, when the families that are most productive for the civilization are preferred to those families which are less productive. That's the main thing that I focused on, but also another thing was like within the family, kind of the priorities during times of lack. During normal times, the young are expected to take care of the older people in the family, even if the older people are not really able to work as much anymore. But if there are times of lack, the old are expected to basically sacrifice themselves for the health of the young. So it's kind of an interesting idea, but it makes sense given how difficult their lives are and how it's a matter of survival. So we're almost ready to move on to the next step. However, there's one thing that I realized she clarified on while she was figuring out some of these other sociological aspects that I think would make sense for me to figure out as well, and that is the values of society. What people value, what culture chooses to make important based on the needs of the society. So I figured out the values and decided on three major ones. The first is resilience / emotional stability, maybe even bordering on stoicism, because people are expected not to hold their emotions with such importance. And this leads us to the next value, which is pragmatism, doing what is right for the community and for society and for your own family, even if it's not exactly the most comfortable thing. And lastly, the third value is faithfulness, religious fervor, commitment to your religion. And I was thinking maybe this could even have like an expression in the culture where families are expected to attend some number of religious events or contribute to them in some sort of way because they believe that the approval of the God who controls the floods is what keeps them able to survive. Each family needs to work with the others to appeal to these gods as much as they can and earn the approval of them so that they can grow food for the year. So now the next step that N.K. Jemisin talks about is basically filling out the society, the culture a little bit, using the details that you know and taking those to their logical conclusion for various aspects of society. So I figured out a bunch of these ripple effects of the sociological factors. I don't want to go through all of them because there's quite a few, so let's just talk about some of the highlights. You can get a good idea for the culture from that, hopefully. So one of the ones that I'm actually correcting from something I said earlier is that rather than trading the bloodstone directly, they heavily guard the secrets of bloodstone smithing, and they make sure to only trade as much as needed during times of famine to get food so they can continue to survive. They really try to preserve the secrets of these weapons. They are kind of xenophobic in that they don't really like outsiders because of that, and they see them as a threat, somebody who can potentially learn these secrets and then they can use them against this group. And part of the reason is because they have this history of different groups trying to invade and gain access to the bloodstone, so they've had to respond by setting up different walls and other barriers. They obviously have the desert to the north as a huge barrier for anybody coming, but they have different checkpoints along the river to make sure that nobody's able to come south, as well as guards on the coast and walls continuing from the mountains in flat areas so that people can't cross over. Another interesting thing was the idea that because the families themselves are so valued in the culture and the family unit is so valued, the eldest person in the family is responsible for recording the individual history of the family. The histories of the important actions that the family has taken are passed down to the young people of the family, and that preserves this like strong sense of family heritage. And also, because of their stoicism, it is taboo for people to display strong emotions, especially outside of the family, and it's actually seen as a sign of weakness. And if repeated by the same member of the family could potentially lead to demotion of the family in the hierarchy. And then one little fun one, they're going to greet each other with words of reverence to the god of the flood. So each person will greet with the same expression, showing those words of reverence. Those are the main societal details I figured out. There's more, of course, but I don't want to dive in too far because it's going to take forever. So I figured out all the world building aspects, but this is the one last part that NK Jemisin talks about, which is actually figuring out what story you tell. And as you can see, she has created examples for a low immersion and a high immersion story within this world. So I think what would be interesting to do is come up with different types of stories that I can tell here, like a one-line sort of premise for different levels of immersion. So I'll create a premise for a low, medium, and high immersion story, and we'll see what we end up with. I just took a second to come up with 3 different examples, 1 low immersion, 1 medium, and 1 high. First, let's start with the low immersion idea. In this premise, we have the top ranked families in the hierarchy all jostling and competing for the top rank through political manipulation. It's told from the perspective of each of the members of the bureaucracy who is responsible for improving the fate of their family through this manipulation. So it'll be told from multiple perspectives, probably third limited. The next example is the medium one, and I actually really like this idea. It sounds pretty interesting. During the defense of one of the ports of this country, a very individualistic, rebellious sort of soldier who's not really that happy with his society's culture is captured, and he finds out that he was taken back to the country in the east, has a completely different culture from theirs. While he's there, he starts to see some of the aspects of his culture that he didn't really like, and at the same time, his host and the person who originally captured him and is showing him these aspects of the different country is actually trying to turn him against his own country and make him into a spy so that they can find out the secrets of the bloodstone smithing. I think that could be a pretty fun one, honestly. The sort of cat and mouse kind of spy thing, and then him not being aware and having the other perspective, creating that like dramatic irony, and then also him trying to reconcile his feelings toward his own culture and trying to figure out which one is right. I guess it makes sense more as like a coming of age story. Anyway. Lastly, the high immersion example. I think this one's actually pretty cool too. It's a member of like a historically low ranking family is trying to find a way to get his family to rise up the ranks so that they can survive what appears to be one of the worst famines that they've ever had. And it's told, of course, from this guy's perspective only because it is my high immersion example. So those are my 3 different premises. I think each of them is pretty cool. Overall, I do think this is actually a really good method for world building for a few reasons. First of all, it is pretty quick. I was able to build this foundation in just 5 or so hours, which is actually quite impressive given how much I was able to create. And that brings us to our next benefit of using this. I feel like it really does help you create this organic world, because if you think back to humanity before the modern era, when we're so proficient at manipulating our environments, oftentimes humans were very much influenced by their environment, and it makes sense that culture itself would be influenced by the environment as well. So figuring out the environment first and then the culture, I think, is actually a really useful concept. And the last thing that I think is really useful is the fact that it helps you build this really strong foundation for the world by coming up with the environmental elements of the culture as well as different sociological elements, and then basing the entire culture on those elements. You get this really cohesive foundation, and I think that it would be much easier to build an entire world from this sort of sturdy foundation. However, it is just a foundation after all, and if I was going to actually write a story in this world, I would need to do a lot more world building to prepare myself and really fill out the world, rather than just having these kind of bare bones foundations. But as far as actually creating a strong foundation, I don't think there's a method that I found that works any better than this so far. So I really do like this method, and we'll potentially do it a few more times in the future, just experimenting, trying to come up with different ideas for different worlds. I think NK Jemisin's method is solid for creating a world, and I think this will end up being my default. I might adjust the process a little bit over time, but I think this is a really good way to come up with that basic foundation and go from there. When I first saw this method, I was intrigued, but as someone who's had difficulty with world building in the past, I was also a little skeptical, especially about the claim of being able to create a new world in just 60 minutes. However, I was pleasantly surprised to have gone through this entire process in just 5 hours, and more importantly, to have found a world building method that works really well for me. I'm curious, have you ever tried world building in this way, and do you want to try world building in this way? Let me know in the comments below. And also, make sure to smash that like button so that YouTube knows to share with other writers like you. Also, I'm kind of tempted to write the medium immersion example that I just mentioned before because it sounds pretty cool. Anyway, we'll see about that one in the future perhaps.